In the long memory of Tamriel, there are moments whispered in shadow, when the fabric between worlds thins and the dreams of gods spill into the waking world. Before the fires of Oblivion swept the Empire, before Daedra walked the cobbled streets of Cyrodiil, there were subtle omens, easy to ignore in the quiet turning of seasons. But they were there, drifting like smoke, lingering like ash before the fire. The stars themselves flickered strangely, constellations seemed to wander, and the dreams of scholars were haunted by stormy skies and crimson suns. Travelers whispered of strange figures in red robes passing silently through towns, and those attuned to Magicka spoke of a trembling in the ethereous. To most, these were little more than superstitions. Yet to the few who listened, to the mages, the mystics, and the watchful, they were the first notes of a terrible song that would soon rise into a roar. For centuries, the Empire had stood, worn but proud. The Septim dynasty, descended from Tiber, Septim himself, held the dragon throne. But like all things mortal, even empires begin to crack from within long before they fall from without. In the final days of Uriel Septim VII's reign, the provinces grew restless. Morrowind seethed beneath the surface. Black Marsh stirred in silence. Even the heart of Cyrodiil was no longer immune to the shadows. And within those shadows moved the Mythic Dawn. They did not march in armies. They did not speak from thrones. They passed unnoticed, priests in crimson, bearing quiet hatred and divine purpose. To them, the world of Nirn was a cage. They worshipped not the nine divines, but Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric prince of destruction. To them, the dragon fires that protected Tamriel from the realms of Oblivion were not a blessing, but a chain, and they had vowed to shatter it. But in those early days, no one knew. There were no flames in the sky yet, no Daedric gates bleeding into the fields. The world still slumbered beneath its illusion of safety. Uriel Septim sat upon his throne, worn by age and prophecy, his heart heavy with knowledge that the threads of fate had begun to unravel. He had dreams, strange, troubling dreams, of crimson towers rising, of burning skies, and of a world drowning in fire. He spoke of them to the Blades, to the Elder Council, but few listened with more than polite concern. Dreams were dreams. The Empire had weathered storms before, and yet, deep beneath the Imperial City, in a quiet chamber hidden by stone and shadow, the Amulet of Kings dimmed, its eternal fire flickering low. Outside, the leaves turned with the season. The streets bustled with the ordinary lives of merchants, pilgrims, and nobles. But somewhere beneath all that noise, a quiet crack appeared in the wall of reality. And through that crack, something ancient stirred. The Oblivion Crisis had not yet begun, but the gates were ready. The story of the Oblivion Crisis truly begins not with fire or war, but with a death. A quiet death, hidden in the bowels of the Imperial City, beneath stone walls and centuries of history. Uriel Septim VII, Emperor of Tamriel, bearer of the Amulet of Kings, and the last living link to Tiber Septim himself, fell not on a battlefield, but in a dark tunnel beneath his own palace. To the world above, the emperor still lived. His banners still flew. His likeness adorned coins, and his name was whispered in reverence across the provinces. But below, fate had already struck. With assassins cloaked in silence and steel, the Mythic Dawn took their first direct blow against the world of mortals. He was not alone in his final hours. With him were the Blades, loyal protectors sworn to the bloodline of the Dragonborn. They had long known the risks. Uriel himself, though burdened with the weight of empire and prophecy, was no fool. He had foreseen the end coming, not in precise detail, but in fragments of vision and unease. For years, he had watched the signs, the failing of the amulet's glow, the unrest among the provinces, and the silence of the gods. And yet, no preparation was enough. The assassin struck with uncanny precision, led by a shadow of a man. Mankar Cameron's disciples, driven not by gold or power, but by faith in destruction. To them, Uriel was not a ruler. He was a gatekeeper, one whose death would open the door to Mehrunes Dagon's triumph. But the Emperor did not die in vain. In those final breaths, with chaos blooming around him and his blades falling in defense, Martin Septim entrusted a stranger, a prisoner, unknown, unnamed, with a task older than kingdoms. The Amulet of Kings, heirloom of Akatosh, was passed from royal hands to the hands of fate. It was the final act of a dying empire, a whispered hope passed in blood. "Close shut the jaws of oblivion," he said, words heavy with meaning. Not just poetic finality, but prophecy. For with his death, the last of the dragon blood was thought extinguished. The Septim line, begun with divine fire and imperial might, was no more. And the amulet, long thought to be inseparable from the throne, now rested in the hands of a forgotten soul. Above, the city carried on in blissful ignorance. The bells did not toll, the banners did not lower, but a silence began to settle in places where once divine protection had lingered. The dragon fires, which had burned unbroken since the days of Alesia, flickered and died. The barriers between worlds thinned, not with thunder, but with a sigh. And in the void between Aetherius and Oblivion, something ancient smiled. The Mythic Dawn had succeeded in the first movement of their symphony of ruin. With the Emperor dead and the amulet removed from the palace, the divine covenant was severed. The protective veil over Tamriel, woven through blood, fire, and pact, had torn. It would not be long before the first gate opened. When the world remembers the Oblivion Crisis, it often pictures the Daedra, the hulking, fire-wreathed monsters stepping from glowing portals, cities in flames, and the final cataclysms. But those horrors did not appear overnight. They were summoned, willed, prepared for. Long before the skies cracked open and Mehrunes Dagon's armies marched upon mortal soil, a hidden cult laid the groundwork in shadows and whispers, the Mythic Dawn. They were not an army in the conventional sense. No grand keeps, no banners, no kingdoms conquered. They were believers, zealots who read prophecy in fire and found purpose in annihilation. To them, Nirn was not a place to be ruled, but to be unmade. A prison of illusion that stifled true freedom. Their master? Cameron, a former Altmare, noble turned prophet of destruction. And their god? Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric prince of change, revolution, and destruction. For decades, the Mythic Dawn embedded themselves into the cracks of society. Scholars, merchants, stewards, and even nobles. Harmless faces by day, devoted cultists by night. They waited, watched, and listened. Their scripture, the commentaries on Mysterium Xarxes, served both as holy writ and coded instruction. Many who read the texts went mad. Others disappeared, but some understood and were reborn. To be a member of the Mythic Dawn was to shed one's name, one's past, and one's doubts. It was a cleansing fire, meant to burn away weakness and shape the faithful into instruments of the apocalypse. They practiced in secret groves, caverns etched with symbols older than history. They performed rituals not for power, but for proximity, to draw closer to the realms beyond Nirn, to feel the stirrings of oblivion. Cameron, their leader, was more than a man. He claimed to have been gifted the Mysterium Xarxes by Mehrunes Dagon himself, a tome bound in the skin of forgotten truths, written in a language of screaming light. Through it, he had glimpsed paradise, a realm crafted not as reward, but as a staging ground for conquest. It was here that he promised salvation, a world reborn not in mercy, but in flame. And the world, in its ignorance, let him preach. By the time the Blades became aware of the cult's true purpose, it was already too late. Their numbers were vast, their positions entrenched, and their belief unshakable. They had assassinated the Emperor and stolen the amulet. But that was only the first offering. Their greater ritual had already begun. The Mythic Dawn believed that Nirn was a lie, that the gods who reigned over it were false keepers, binding mortal souls to a cycle of suffering and illusion. Mehrunes Dagon, they claimed, offered truth through destruction. Only when the world was broken could it be made real again. With each chant, each blade drawn in sacrifice, each secret ritual performed beneath the cities of Tamriel, they weakened the barriers. They whispered to the void, and the void began to whisper back. And then, one by one, the gates began to open. Flaming circles of ancient runes, molten at the edges, appeared in forests, fields, even within city walls. From them emerged the soldiers of Oblivion, clad in jagged armor, bearing weapons that pulsed with hateful energy. Tamriel, long protected by divine fire, had become vulnerable. The realms of mortals and Daedra began to bleed together. But for the Mythic Dawn, this was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. They cheered at the burning of towns, praised the shrieks of the dying, and sang praises as Oblivion consumed the land. Their time had come. As the Mythic Dawn's flames spread across Tamriel, few truly understood how close the world had come to complete unraveling. To the unknowing citizen, the chaos seemed sudden. Random gates erupting, beasts emerging, and cities falling. But behind every portal, behind every calculated assault, lay the guiding hand of a cult whose faith burned hotter than any inferno. The Mythic Dawn did not fear death. They embraced it. They welcomed the destruction of their physical forms if it meant accelerating the unraveling of Mundus. They believed that through Dagon's scouring flame, their spirits would ascend to paradise, Mankar Cameron's pocket realm, where they would serve eternally in the New Order. Paradise, in truth, was no heaven. It was a crucible, a landscape of eternal war where those who perished in Nirn were endlessly tested. Those who failed were torn apart and reformed again and again, until their spirit was tempered into unbreakable devotion. In this way, Cameron created an army of unshakable believers, forged not through loyalty alone, but through metaphysical torment. And all the while, the realm of paradise remained separate from Oblivion, a masterstroke of tonal manipulation through the powers of the Xarxes. A twisted miracle in the name of unmaking the world. The Mythic Dawn's greatest act of terror was not the murder of Emperor Septim VII, though that act shattered the Dragonborn line, nor was it the opening of 1,000 Oblivion gates. Their greatest triumph was the illusion of silence before the storm. For years, they sowed discontent in hidden corners of the Empire, destabilizing its foundations. They infiltrated local leadership, corrupted mages, and planted agents within scholarly and political circles. They robbed the Empire of its cohesion before the swords were drawn. And yet, it was not just the Empire they aimed to dismantle. It was Akatosh's covenant, the divine pact that sealed Nirn off from the plains of Oblivion. The Amulet of Kings, more than just a relic, was a metaphysical anchor. It embodied the bloodline of the Dragonborn and symbolized divine legitimacy. By assassinating Septim and stealing the amulet, the Mythic Dawn struck directly at the heart of that covenant. Without a true heir to wear the amulet and light the dragon fires, the veil between worlds thinned. One by one, cities fell. Kvatch was the first major stronghold to crumble. The gate outside its walls opened with unnatural speed and intensity, pouring forth an invasion unlike anything Tamriel had seen in centuries. Daedric's siege engines, scamps, Clanfear, and flame Atronax marched in coordinated waves. Citizens were dragged into the fire, not just to die, but to be taken, sacrificed, bound to Dagon's will. And the Mythic Dawn watched with reverent awe, even as the blades scrambled to protect Martin Septim. The last heir, they found themselves hounded by invisible enemies. Cultists who knew every back alley, every shadow grove, every unguarded moment. The Empire, broken from within, struggled to contain what was no longer just a war. It was apocalypse engineered with religious precision. The Mythic Dawn's belief was more potent than any army. Their strength lay not in numbers, but in purpose. And when Mehrunes Dagon stepped through the largest gate, towering above the white gold tower, shaking the very sky with his arrival, it was the ultimate prayer answered. They had done it. They had brought their god to Nirn. But power built on illusion is fragile. And while the Mythic Dawn celebrated, a spark remained, hidden in the form of Martin Septim and the uncertain hands of a prisoner who would shape history. For all their cunning, all their vision, the cult could not account for the stubborn flame of mortal resistance. Nor could they stop what came next, the final moments of the crisis, and a sacrifice that would end their dark reign. But before that reckoning, Tamriel would suffer. Paradise had opened, yes, but it had not brought peace. It had unleashed a storm that would redefine divinity itself. When Uriel Septim VII fell beneath the blades of the Mythic Dawn assassins, the Amulet of Kings fell from his neck, a crimson, radiant relic steeped in divine history. It did not shatter. It did not fade. It simply fell, as if waiting, as if listening for the heartbeat of the one who would next carry its burden. This amulet was not merely a symbol of imperial power. It was a keystone of reality. Bound to the covenant of Akatosh, it sealed the barriers between Oblivion and Nirn, woven with the essence of starlight and dragonblood. For generations, it had rested upon the necks of the Septim emperors, a silent guardian warding off the Daedric realms. But with Uriel's death and no crowned heir, the covenant was broken, and the veil between worlds weakened with every passing breath. In the chaos following the assassination, the Blades turned to a desperate hope. Among their hidden records was mention of a forgotten son, Martin Septim, illegitimate, raised in secret, a humble priest in the chapel of Akatosh in Kvatch. He was not trained for thrones or wars. He knew sermons, not swords. And yet, the blood of Tiber Septim stirred in his veins, unrecognized even by himself. Fate, ever cunning, placed the task of delivering him into the hands of a nameless prisoner, an anonymous soul recently freed from the dungeons of the imperial city. This prisoner, neither noble nor chosen, would become the hinge on which history turned. Through fire, siege, and death, they reached Kvatch just after the Daedric invasion. There, amidst the ruins and screams, they found Martin, shaken, disbelieving, but alive. Martin's acceptance of his bloodline was not immediate. He had lived as a healer, a teacher, and a man of faith. To him, royalty meant nothing, but the death of his emperor father, the fall of his city, and the unnatural storm sweeping Tamriel demanded that he embrace his destiny, not for glory, but for the salvation of all life. The amulet, however, had been lost, stolen during the confusion. The Blades knew the next steps were clear. Recover the amulet, restore Martin to the throne, and relight the dragon fires to seal Oblivion away once more. But each of those goals was perilously distant. The cult grew bolder. Gates continued to open across Cyrodiil, and rumors spoke of entire regions swallowed by flame. Martin's journey to leadership was inward as much as it was outward. He began as a priest, soft-spoken, philosophical. But slowly, tragedy shaped him into something greater. Not a warlord, but a spiritual beacon. He studied the Daedric texts, pored over ancient tomes, and deciphered the writings of Mankar Cameron. He did not wield a crown, but carried knowledge as his sword. It was Martin who discovered the true nature of paradise. It was Martin who unraveled Cameron's illusion and began plotting a counter-ritual, not just to light the fires, but to end Dagon's invasion permanently. He realized that simply sealing the gates would not be enough. The threat had grown beyond their realm. Mehrunes Dagon had touched Nirn directly. The world needed more than restoration. It needed a reckoning. The Amulet of Kings, when finally recovered from the hands of the Mythic Dawn, pulsed with latent power. But it would no longer suffice as a ceremonial relic. It had to become a conduit, a vessel not for kingship, but for sacrifice. And Martin knew that to stop Dagon, he would need to do what no emperor before him had done. Not rule, but become a bridge between God and mortal. This was the moment when Martin Septim ceased being a reluctant heir and became a legend in the making. His destiny was no longer to wear a crown, but to shatter it for the sake of all. But the storm was still rising. Cameron still ruled from his false paradise, and Dagon's shadow loomed larger. The final act of the crisis had not yet begun. To understand the heart of the Oblivion Crisis, one must wander into the dream that birthed it. Paradise, the domain of Manker Cameron. Not the scorched, chaotic plains of Oblivion familiar to mortals, but a realm of serene beauty, veined with horror and bound by illusion. It was here, in this pocket of Oblivion shaped by Cameron's will, that the Mythic Dawn believed salvation would be found. And it was here the truth of their madness lay bare. Manker Cameron had once been a scholar, a mystic of the Iliad line, perhaps, or a child of Myrish descent, cloaked in ancient blood and ambition. How he came to possess the Mysterium Xarxes remains a question unanswered. Some claim it was gifted by Mehrunes Dagon himself, its pages bleeding with secrets. Others whisper that Cameron wrote parts of it, shaped by visions that tore its sanity. Whatever the truth, the Xarxes became his gospel, and paradise his cathedral. He declared the gods to be false. The divines, he claimed, were jailers, and Nirn, a prison. Lorcan's trick had ensnared mortals in flesh, and the dragon fires were bars on a cosmic cage. Dagon, he said, was not a destroyer, but a liberator. To burn the world was to free it from illusion. The Mythic Dawn devoured these words, believing that Oblivion's flames would cleanse the soul and reveal the truth beyond mortal constraint. Paradise, Cameron said, awaited those who died in Dagon's name. And so they offered blood, emperors, priests, innocents, all sacrificed in ritual to open the gates. And when they died, their spirits did not pass into Etherius. Instead, they awoke in Gaer Alata, Cameron's fabricated Eden, verdant cliffs, rivers of light, stone towers of impossible beauty. It was not hell. It was worse, a lie made perfect. But this paradise was not free. Souls there served eternally, unable to leave, their consciousnesses filtered through Cameron's will. Even the greatest among them, the ascended immortals, were merely former mortals twisted by myth and bound in fealty. Some remembered pain, others remembered purpose. All were prisoners. Martin Septim, alongside the hero of Kvatch, knew they must reach this realm. For only within it could Cameron be slain. Only there could the Mysterium Xarxes be undone. But no portal could be forced. It had to be opened from within, using the book itself as a key. Martin's studies of the Xarxes revealed fragments of arcane geometry, Daedric riddles, and tonal invocations twisted by Mehrunes' influence. Each page was a war against comprehension. But Martin endured. When at last the portal was opened, the hero stepped through, not into a battlefield, but into Cameron's constructed perfection. Every leaf shimmered with divine intent. Yet beneath the surface rot, the rivers sang with souls. The skies wept light, but it was artificial. Cameron greeted the hero as one might greet a long-expected guest, confident and serene. He believed his victory inevitable. The amulet had been lost, the septims extinguished, the dragon fires forever dark. He spoke of Tamriel as a failed plane, and of his paradise as the template for a new world, reshaped in Dagon's name. He claimed to be beyond death. But what is made can be unmade. And so, blade met illusion. The battle that followed was more than flesh and steel. It was a war of beliefs. Cameron wielded magic pulled from the core of the Xarxes, while his realm itself bent to his fury. But with strength, cunning, and perhaps a bit of divine providence, the hero struck the fatal blow. Manker Cameron fell, his body dissolving, his illusion fracturing, and paradise collapsed with him. When the hero returned, the skies above Tamriel were darker still. Dagon's forces surged, for Cameron's death had not ended the crisis. It had only unmasked its final stage. The Amulet of Kings had been recovered. The Mythic Dawn was shattered, but the Gates of Oblivion still yawned wide. The moment was near. The battle for Tamriel would soon become a battle within Tamriel, as Mehrunes Dagon himself prepared to walk the mortal world. The first gate opened outside Kvatch. A crimson wound tore through the fabric of Nirn, and from it, nightmares poured forth. Fire, ash, and ruin followed in their wake. Creatures wrought of claw and flame, driven not by hunger, but by a singular, unrelenting will, Mehrunes Dagon's will. And so began the true face of the Oblivion Crisis, not as a whisper in myth, but as fire made flesh. The Daedric siege of Kvatch was not merely destruction, it was demonstration. The gate pulsed like a living thing, a gaping maw into a realm of endless torment. Tamriel had faced war. Tamriel had faced blight. But this was different. This was invasion from beyond reality. Each gate served as a conduit to Dagon's deadlands, a realm of towering spires, flowing lava, and skies scorched by eternal storms. What passed through them was only a fragment of the horrors lurking beyond. The hero of Kvatch would become legend for what they did next. Not for fleeing, but for entering. They stepped into the infernal landscape, not as a soldier, but as a mortal facing gods. Inside, they saw the truth, Spider Daedra weaving webs of sorrow, Clanfear prowling like sentient beasts, Flame Atronax burning paths in the blood-red soil. And at the heart of it all stood the Sigil Tower, pulsing with Daedric energy. The gates could not be closed from the outside. The only way to seal them was to ascend the tower, battle through hordes of Daedra, and remove the sigil stone anchoring it to Nirn. This stone, shaped like crystal and burning with an unnatural glow, was the heart of the invasion. Once pulled, the gate would collapse the rift ceiling behind it, but not without a price. Every descent into Oblivion wore on the hero's body, mind, and soul. And yet they did it, again and again. Soon, gates opened across Cyrodiil, one in Cheydinhal, 2 outside Bruma, a dozen along the Gold Road. Cities burned, and the Imperial Legion, proud defenders of the Empire, found themselves outmatched. No sword could slay a realm. No wall could hold back a god. Each gate presented a nightmare unique to its region, as if Oblivion itself tailored its assault. Behind these invasions was not chaos, but design. Dagon had waited centuries for this moment. With the Dragon fires unlit, the barriers between Mundus and Oblivion had weakened. Without the divine covenant sealed by the Amulet of Kings, Tamriel was vulnerable, and Dagon's cult had prepared the way, sabotaging defenses, assassinating leadership, and ensuring the Empire stood fractured. And yet, hope remained. Martin Septim, the last of his line, had been found. Though humble in station, his blood carried the power to reignite the divine bond. But to do so, the amulet must be recovered, the Elder Council convinced, and the forces of Oblivion held at bay long enough for the ritual to be performed. It was a race not merely against time, but against reality itself unraveling. Some gates were closed by local heroes, others by chance, but many remained open, festering wounds in the land. Forests blackened, villages vanished, trade routes were severed, and everywhere the people prayed for rescue, for salvation, for an end. What they received instead was fire and silence. The Mythic Dawn, though fractured, still moved in shadows. Their remaining agents acted not out of faith, but fanaticism. The dream of Cameron had become the nightmare of Nirn, and yet they pressed on, convinced their master's design would be fulfilled, even in death. Amid this storm, the hero of Kvatch became more than mortal. They were seen not as a person, but as a symbol, a blade cutting through the smoke, a torch in the ash. To many, they were the only hope left, and in the city of Bruma, that hope would soon be tested in fire. Snow fell gently over Bruma, blanketing the Nord-built city in a quiet calm that betrayed the storm gathering beyond its walls. Located high in the Gerald Mountains, Bruma had long stood as a bastion of resilience, a city of stone and stubborn hearts. But now, its cobbled streets would serve as the front lines of a war not just for Tamriel, but for reality itself. The Oblivion Gates had come to Bruma, not one but many. Where other cities had faced isolated incursions, Bruma became the stage for something larger, a coordinated, full-scale assault, as though Mehrunes Dagon himself had focused his gaze on its snowy ramparts. Towering Daedric portals loomed outside the city, their hellish glow bathing the white hills in blood-red light. The Deadlands spilled forth, legions of scamps, Daedroths, Clanfear, and the ever-burning Atronax. The earth shook beneath their advance. The air cracked with distant roars. Inside Bruma, fear simmered. Countess Narina Carvane, ever proud and practical, prepared her city for what might be its final stand. Barricades were raised. Militia trained day and night. Still, it would not be enough. The city needed a champion. They turned, as so many others had, to the one now known as the hero of Kvatch. But the hero knew that brute force would not win the day. To face the flood of Oblivion, Bruma would need allies, soldiers from every corner of Cyrodiil. Thus began a journey of diplomacy and unity. The hero traveled to Coral, Skingrad, Leowian, and beyond, convincing counts and commanders to send aid. It was no easy task. Suspicion ran deep, and fear ran deeper. Yet slowly, the banners arrived. Blade and bow, shield and spell. A rare moment of solidarity in an empire teetering on collapse. Then came the day of reckoning. The sky split with red lightning as the final, massive gate opened just beyond Bruma's northern pass. It dwarfed all that had come before, its spiked frame stretching into the stormy heavens. From it poured a legion, unending and unrelenting. The defenders of Bruma lined the snowy fields, a patchwork army of legionnaires, mercenaries, town guards, and volunteers. At their center stood the hero, sword gleaming, armor worn from countless battles in realms not meant for mortals. The battle was brutal. Daedra clashed with defenders in a cacophony of screams, fire, and steel. The snow turned to slush, then to blood. Siege engines roared. Magic flashed through the sky like angry stars. The ground itself shook with each passing moment, as if the land resisted the invasion. But amid the chaos, the hero once again did the unthinkable. They entered the largest gate alone. The deadlands within were more violent, more alive. Towering sigil keepers stood guard. Magma rivers surged around platforms suspended in air. The hero fought their way to the central tower, every step forward a defiance of Dagon's will. At the tower's peak, the sigil stone pulsed, a heart of flame and fury. With a final act of resolve, the hero grasped it. In a blinding flash, the gate collapsed, the sky cleared, and the tide of battle shifted. Daedra, severed from their anchor, fell or fled. Cheers rang out across Bruma, exhausted but victorious. The city still stood. The siege of Bruma became legend, not just for its scale, but for what it represented. Unity in the face of annihilation. From this moment forward, the Empire recognized the threat for what it was. Not a cult, not a crisis, but a full-scale war against the Daedric Prince of Destruction himself. And the hero of Kvatch was no longer merely a symbol of hope. They were a general, a leader, a warrior touched by Oblivion and not consumed. And above all, time was running out. Martin Septim, rightful heir to the dragon throne, now stood ready to take the next step. The Amulet of Kings had been recovered. The Elder Council stirred. And beneath the Temple of the One in the Imperial City, the fate of all things began to gather its weight. Beneath the marble domes of the Imperial City, in the sacred heart of the Temple District, stood a relic from the dawn of the Septim Empire, the Temple of the One. Its great oculus opened toward the heavens, and its walls, ancient and silent, had borne witness to coronations, funerals, and centuries of divine ceremony. Yet now, that hallowed chamber sat dormant. The dragon fires, once lit by the emperors of Cyrodiil to seal the veil between Mundus and Oblivion, had long since gone dark. And in that darkness, the barriers had cracked. Martin Septim stood at the center of it all, cloaked not in royal silk, but in monk's robes. The last living heir of Tiber Septim, raised in secrecy by the priests of Akatosh, had not asked for this burden. Yet he bore it with quiet determination. In his hands rested the Amulet of Kings, its crimson gem pulsing faintly, resonating with the blood of the Dragonborn and the divine spark of Akatosh himself. He had spent his days in Cloud Ruler Temple preparing for this very moment, scouring ancient texts, studying prophecies, and unlocking truths that had lain dormant since the founding of the Empire. But knowledge was not enough. Ritual required action, and the Temple of the One had not felt the fire of the dragon in generations. To relight the dragon fires and seal the portals to Oblivion, Martin would have to perform a rite unlike any other, a combination of divine blood, sacred flame, and metaphysical precision. This was not a simple lighting of a torch. It was a convergence of realms, a statement to the cosmos that Nirn was not yet lost, that the mortal plane still had guardians, that the line of kings had not fallen into silence. Meanwhile, the Elder Council wrestled with uncertainty. The political vacuum left by Uriel Septim's death had become a storm of egos and fears. High Chancellor Okado, noble and pragmatic, recognized Martin's claim, though unorthodox, as the only path forward. Yet many doubted. Could a bastard-born monk truly carry the mantle of Dragonborn? Could faith replace a throne? Outside the marble walls, the world burned. Cities smoldered. Oblivion gates opened faster than they could be closed. The cult of Mehrunes Dagon, the Mythic Dawn, had begun its final rites. The very stars above flickered, as if the cosmos itself held its breath. And so Martin and the hero of Kvatch stood at the center of fate, twin pillars against the storm. The hero had faced countless realms of torment, seized sigil stones from the depths of chaos, and brought the amulet home. Yet their final task was not one of blade or bow. It was to protect Martin, body and soul, as he completed the ritual that might yet save the world. The dragon fires had once been kindled by Alessia herself, blessed by Akatosh, sealed with divine blood. Now, a millennium later, the cycle would begin again, or fail completely. In quiet chambers beneath the temple, Martin began his preparations. He spoke ancient prayers in the tongue of the Aelids and whispered names of the divines lost to time. The amulet hummed in resonance. Akatosh stirred in some far corner of the Etherius. Even the walls of Oblivion seemed to pause, as if sensing what was to come. Outside, the city held its breath. It began with tremors. The cobblestones of the imperial city quivered beneath the feet of citizens and soldiers alike. At first, the tremors were small, like the distant echoes of thunder. But then came the winds, howling, violent, unnatural. A crimson sky stretched above the white gold tower, darkened as if the very sun had been devoured. And then the sound, a sound that would never be forgotten. Not a roar, nor a scream, but something deeper. A war horn of cosmic scale. The arrival of a Daedric prince. Mehrunes Dagon, the Lord of Destruction, crossed the threshold between realms. He did not emerge through a gate. He did not creep from shadow or appear in whisper. He came in full form, towering above the city like a mountain of flesh, fire, and wrath. For arms, each the size of towers, eyes like molten suns. His footfalls cracked the streets, his breath melted stone. The barriers between Nirn and Oblivion were torn apart in his wake. The final ritual of the Mythic Dawn had succeeded. The dragon fires remained unlit. And now, the Daedra no longer needed portals. They had found a passage in the flesh of reality itself. Panic gripped the city. Soldiers of the Imperial Legion, hardened by years of war and discipline, faltered. Citizens fled, screaming, into alleyways and ruined temples. The white gold tower shuddered under the prince's steps. Lightning danced along its spire. Fire rained from the skies. All seemed lost. But in the heart of the chaos stood Martin Septim, calm, resolute, and unwavering. Beside him was the hero of Kvatch, blade drawn, armor scorched from countless battles in Oblivion. Together, they pressed forward through Daedra and destruction toward the Temple of the One. The final sanctuary, the final hope. Dagon roared, not just in fury, but in triumph. For centuries he had been kept at bay by the Pact of Akatosh, the seal of the dragon fires. Now, with the amulet unlit and the line of Septims broken, he strode upon a mortal plane with the intent of conquest, not by whispers or cults, but by flame and fist. Yet Martin knew something Dagon did not. The Amulet of Kings was not merely a key, it was a conduit. The blood of the Dragonborn was not just a symbol, it was a flame. And Akatosh, though distant, had not abandoned Nirn. Inside the shattered temple of the One, Martin raised the amulet high. The air crackled. Time itself seemed to pause. And then, in an eruption of golden light, the amulet shattered. Not in failure, but in offering. Martin Septim, the last heir of Tiber Septim, gave his mortal form to the divine. In his place rose a dragon of impossible scale, formed from fire, time, and divinity, the avatar of Akatosh. It roared, not in rage, but in judgment. Dagon turned to face it, his form towering and terrifying. But even a prince of Oblivion was dwarfed by the force of eternity made manifest. The battle was swift, but titanic. Fire met fire, claw met blade. The sky split with light. And when it was done, Mehrunes Dagon was cast back into the realms of Oblivion, his presence violently erased from Nirn. In the silence that followed, only the golden statue of the dragon remained, frozen in time, wings spread, forever guarding the heart of the Empire. Martin Septim was gone, but the world was saved. Silence settled over the imperial city like a mourning shroud. The fires that had once threatened to consume the heart of Tamriel were extinguished, leaving behind ash, crumbled stone, and smoke rising into the dawn. But for all the destruction that surrounded them, the people stood, not in terror, but in stunned reverence. The sky, once blood-red and writhing with Oblivion's corruption, now stretched in a pale, golden hush. It was over. The crisis had ended. The statue of the dragon, a towering monument wrought of divine stone and fused light, stood in the center of the Temple of the One. None dared approach it at first. None knew whether to kneel, weep, or simply stare in awe. For that statue was not merely sculpture. It was Martin Septim, fused into the avatar of Akatosh, forever frozen in the moment of his godly sacrifice. The Oblivion Crisis had begun with shadow and treachery, but it ended with light and legend. In the days that followed, the Empire stirred from its devastation like a dreamer waking after a long nightmare. The hero of Kvatch, still clad in battle-worn armor, emerged as both witness and survivor. Wherever they walked, people bowed their heads, not merely in respect, but in silent gratitude. It was through their hands and Martin's heart that the world had been pulled back from the edge. Across Cyrodiil, the effects of the crisis lingered. Oblivion gates, now inert and crumbling, dotted the landscape like scars left by divine warfare. The land bore wounds, forests burned, villages razed, and the very fabric of reality torn. But it also bore resilience. The people rebuilt, stone by stone, prayer by prayer, hope by memory. Yet the world had changed irrevocably. With Martin's sacrifice, the line of the Dragonborn emperors had ended. No heir remained. No Amulet of Kings to pass on. The Empire, for the first time in centuries, stood without a Septim upon the ruby throne. The Elder Council reconvened within the white gold tower. They spoke in hushed tones and uncertain hearts, knowing they now bore the burden of guiding an empire without divine right. Chancellor Okado, a calm and cautious presence, stepped forward to serve as potentate, a steward of peace rather than a ruler of destiny. It was not a time of glory. It was a time of healing. Many asked whether Martin had truly become a god, or if Akatosh had merely answered his prayer. Temples of the Divines offered differing stories. Some claimed the dragon god of time had fused with Martin out of love for mortals. Others whispered that it was a final act of balance, order restored against the rising tide of chaos. And yet others said Martin had ceased to exist, his soul burned away in the fire of sacrifice. But one truth remained. Mehrunes Dagon had been defeated, not banished temporarily, as in past eras, but driven back by the full force of divine intervention. And his cult, the Mythic Dawn, was shattered, its members dead, dispersed, or hunted to extinction. Despite the return of peace, the wounds of the crisis were deep. Families mourned the lost. Cities bore scars. and fear lingered in the edges of dreams. Firth Daedra could once breach the world so fully. Who could say it wouldn't happen again? But even fear was tempered by remembrance. The statue of the dragon remained, silent and noble, casting long shadows across the temple grounds as if guarding the very soul of the empire. Pilgrims came from all corners of Tamriel, not only to weep, but to give thanks, to remember Martin, not as an emperor, but as a man who chose the flame. A man who, in the final hour, became more than mortal. In the soft light of the years that followed, Tamriel breathed again. The world did not return to what it had been before the crisis, for how could it? Something within the soul of the continent had changed, subtly but permanently. The veil between the mortal world and the realms beyond had been torn, and even after it was mended, the memory of its fraying remained. Yet life, ever persistent, returned. Fields once scorched by Daedric flame began to green once more. Farmers replanted with cautious hope, their eyes turning skyward with prayers for rain and peace. Merchants reopened their shops, warriors laid down their blades, and children, those too young to remember the horrors, laughed again in the streets of rebuilt cities. The great province of Cyrodiil, heart of the empire, was no longer the polished jewel it once was, but a cracked crown, flawed, yet still worn with pride. Across the empire, statues of Martin Septim were erected, sometimes beside the divines themselves. He was remembered not for his rule, brief as it had been, but for his sacrifice. No ruler, no hero, no saint had ever given so completely of themselves to protect the world. And so, a new age dawned, not of golden banners and triumphant horns, but of quiet resilience. The Elder Council governed with a steady hand, but without the divine authority of the dragonborn emperors. Cracks began to appear in the once unified empire. Provinces like Hammerfell and Black Marsh grew more independent, their people less willing to bow to an empire that no longer bore the blood of Akatosh. Still, the council held the center for a time. Scholars and mages debated what had truly happened during the Oblivion Crisis. The Arcane University published treatises on Daedric Gate mechanics, while others investigated the nature of divine intervention. Could a mortal truly summon a god? Could the barrier between Oblivion and Nirn be breached again? The question sparked endless debate. Meanwhile, the people honored their own myths. In Bruma, the gates that once seethed with fire now lay in silent ruin, marked with stone and incense by the grateful townsfolk. In Kvatch, rebuilt from its complete destruction, a shrine to the heroes stood beside a newly raised chapel, symbolizing the union of sword and spirit that had saved them. And yet, amidst this quiet rebuilding, the world turned. In the shadows, whispers of new threats began to stir. The Thalmor, watching from the Somerset Isles, noted the Empire's weakness with calculating eyes. In Skyrim, ancient powers slumbered, waiting to be awakened by blood and prophecy. But for the moment, those threats were distant. For the people of Cyrodiil, the crisis was past. They lived in the calm after the storm. A strange calm, a world left wondering, what comes after heroes? The Mythic Dawn, though shattered, did not vanish entirely. Their surviving texts, hidden in caves, buried in ruins, were sought by curious cultists and mad scholars alike. The writings of Mankar Cameron, though blasphemous, found new life in whispers and forbidden circles. The veil torn by the crisis might be closed, but its edges still glowed faintly, tempting the bold and the foolish. The dragon statue in the temple of the one never aged, never dulled. It stood eternal, an unblinking sentinel watching over a city rebuilt from ruin. Pilgrims left offerings at its base, flowers, coins, even pages of poetry praising the dragonborn who had become a god. Some claimed to hear faint echoes when they stood close, like a heartbeat beneath the stone, or the slow inhale of something vast and watching. Tamriel was changed, perhaps wounded, perhaps wiser. The Oblivion Crisis had not merely ended an era. It had begun something new, a slow unraveling of old power, a quiet birth of uncertainty. Yet in the face of it, the people endured. They remembered. They rebuilt. And beneath the weight of history and myth, the world turned once more, silent, watchful, waiting. Even after the last Oblivion Gate had collapsed into dust and silence, the realm of Nirn bore the imprint of what had passed through. The crisis left not only scorched landscapes and shattered walls, it etched itself into memory, into culture, into the very way mortals viewed the world beyond their own. The Daedra were no longer distant myths. They had walked among the living. Cities had burned under their assault, and entire provinces bore the trauma of their touch. In Cyrodiil, old tales once told to frighten children became grim reality, and the myths of Oblivion found new life as history. In the years following the crisis, the academic halls of Tamriel saw an explosion of study focused on the Daedric princes. No longer were their influences simply warnings in chapel sermons. They became subjects of research, scrutiny, and fearful fascination. Tomes once locked away in restricted libraries were copied and circulated among elite scholars. Mages speculated openly on the nature of Oblivion, its structures, its laws, and whether such realms could ever again spill into the mortal plane. The legacy of Mankr Cameron lingered like smoke. Though his paradise was destroyed and his followers scattered, fragments of the Mythic Dawn endured in secret. Hidden cults emerged in the decades after the crisis. Pale shadows of the original order, often misunderstood, were led by delusional pretenders. Yet each bore the same hunger, to touch the divine, to return to a realm glimpsed in dreams and madness. Some survivors of the crisis, both soldiers and citizens, reported strange visions long after the gates were sealed. Dreams of vast, starless skies, whispers in languages they could not name, feelings of being watched from beyond the veil. Priests assured them these were echoes, nothing more, trauma echoing through the soul like aftershocks. But others believed that remnants of Oblivion had not fully departed, that cracks remained, thin and subtle, waiting to widen once again. In art, literature, and song, the crisis became the source of 1,000 new works. Painters depicted the flaming skies of Kvatch with surreal brushstrokes. Poets recited epics of the hero of Kvatch and the martyrdom of Martin Septim beneath the dragon's flame. Even common folk told tales around their hearths, stories of bravery, loss, and a moment when the divine touched the world. And the Empire, changed though it was, used the crisis as a symbol. The image of the dragon statue became an emblem of resistance. Coins minted after the crisis bore a new inscription, from flame, faith. The High Chancellor, and those who followed in his stead, often invoked the crisis in speeches, rallying the people with memories of unity in darkness. Yet beneath this surface of reverence, deeper questions stirred. Had the Empire truly won? Or had it merely survived? The Septim line was gone. The Dragon fires were extinguished. Akatosh had intervened, but at what cost? The ancient covenant between the divines and the Empire was broken, and none could say if it could ever be renewed. The white gold tower still stood, but some said its glow seemed fainter, its magic slower to answer. In Morrowind, where Daedra worship was practiced openly by the Dunmare, the crisis was viewed with complex emotion. Some called it a reckoning, a reminder that the Daedric princes were not to be trusted. Others, especially among the Ashlanders and dissident priests, saw it as a warning that the mortal world had forgotten its balance, placing too much faith in linear rule and forgetting the chaotic truths beneath. Meanwhile, in the Somerset Isles, whispers of rising Altmarai power began to grow bolder. The Thalmor, long critical of imperial doctrine, claimed the Oblivion Crisis was proof that the divines had abandoned man, that the Empire was a failed experiment. They spoke in quiet rooms of a new order, one led not by the dragon blood of old, but by elven clarity and control. It was a whisper then. It would become a storm in time, but that time had not yet come. For now, Tamriel remained suspended in the aftermath, a continent caught between gratitude and grief, rebuilding with hands still trembling from what they had seen. A world not quite healed, but no longer bleeding. The echoes of the crisis were faint, but unforgotten. And so the people watched the sky, and they listened, and they waited. In the decades following the end of the Oblivion Crisis, the event slowly passed from live horror into reverent memory. It became a story told in candlelit chapels and etched into murals across the provinces of Tamriel. But as time wore on, the sharp edges of fear dulled into myth, and from myth rose legend. The hero of Kvatch, once a figure of flesh and bone, became almost divine in stature. No histories agreed on the hero's name. Some claimed they were a Nord, others a Breton, and a few whispered they were even a lost Septim, returned in secret. What mattered most was not their origin, but their legacy. Statues of the hero were raised across Cyrodiil, often alongside depictions of Martin Septim, whose sacrifice had sealed the rift and ended the crisis. The two became twin flames in the memory of the people, mortal and divine, steel and soul. Bards wove tales of the final battle at the Temple of the One, where fire met stone, and the Dragon of Time descended to lock the jaws of Oblivion. Songs spoke of golden light, of silence so pure it stilled even the heartbeats of onlookers, of Daedric titans falling like ash before the breath of Akatosh incarnate. Whether those present truly saw such wonders, or merely remember them that way, no longer mattered. The stories had taken root. Temples honored the crisis in yearly rituals. The Day of Flame's End, as it became known in Cyrodiil, saw people gather with lanterns and quiet prayers, walking through streets where Oblivion once touched the soil. In the Imperial City, clergy held silent vigils by the dragon statue, laying wreaths and recalling the final roar that tore across the sky. And yet, beneath this sanctified memory, deeper philosophical ripples spread across Nirn. The crisis had not only changed the Empire, it had changed how mortals viewed themselves. No longer were they merely observers of divine will. Mortals had fought the Daedra. They had closed the gates. A single man had stood in place of a god and held back a prince of destruction. In the Arcane University and beyond, scholars began to ask uneasy questions. If mortals could repel Daedric invasion, could they one day ascend further? Was the line between God and man thinner than believed? Some recalled tales of Tiber Septim's apotheosis and of the tribunal of Morrowind. Were these exceptions or signs of mortal potential unrealized? Among the Dunmer, the crisis cast new shadows over their faith in the Daedra. Though worship did not cease, it was tempered by memory. Even Bothia and Mephala, revered by many Dunmer, were seen in a more cautious light. The Tribunal Temple, already in decline, used the crisis as a warning. Meddling with powers beyond the mortal coil would always bring ruin, even if draped in reverence. Elsewhere, in Skyrim and Hammerfell, warriors commemorated the dead not just with tales, but with steel. Orders were founded in the wake of the crisis. Knightly bands sworn to defend Tamriel should the realms of Oblivion ever breach the veil again. Some wore crimson cloaks to honor the skies that burned. Others bore dragon emblems, invoking Martin and Akatosh's final union. But there were those who remembered the crisis not with honor, but with fear. In hidden coves and candlelit ruins, fragments of the Mythic Dawn still stirred. Though their prophet was gone, and their paradise lost, the dream of unmaking the world had not died. Some believed the crisis had been but a test, a failed attempt at enlightenment. These cultists whispered of the true dawn, a time when Mehrunes Dagon would rise again, this time with no dragon to stop him. Governments cracked down on such groups, but the memory of the crisis had created both protectors and imitators. As with all great events in history, the light it cast also created deeper shadows. Perhaps most poignant, however, was the change within the common people. The farmer who had once prayed for rain now prayed for peace. The merchant who once feared bandits now feared the skies themselves. For even as the days grew calm again, and Tamriel's wounds faded beneath time's patient hand, the people knew one thing with certainty: the worlds beyond were real. and they could reach through. The Oblivion Crisis was no longer just a story. It had become a caution, etched into the bones of Nirn itself. And so, the people remembered. With every passing year, with every telling, with every whispered prayer to keep the gates closed and the skies silent, the crisis lived on, not as fear, but as knowledge. That the balance between realms is fragile. That vigilance must never fade. That the fire, once lit, can return. When the fires of the Oblivion Crisis finally faded, and the last red glow of the portals dimmed from memory, Tamriel found itself standing in the quiet aftermath. Yet in that hush, the true weight of what had been lost settled over the land. Not just the toll in lives or cities, but something deeper, more intangible. The Empire was whole in body, but hollow in soul. Martin Septim's death marked more than the end of a man. It marked the extinction of the dragon bloodline, a lineage once believed to be divinely protected, divinely guided. With no heir to the ruby throne, and the Amulet of Kings turned to ash, the foundation upon which the Empire was built, dragon fire, lineage, covenant, crumbled. The Elder Council, ever a symbol of structure, tried to hold fast to its role. They claimed authority in Martin's absence, insisting that continuity was possible through bureaucracy and ancient law. But governance without vision, without divine sanction, lacked the fire that had once united diverse provinces under a single banner. The Empire no longer stood tall. It drifted rudderless. In Cyrodiil, some cities fell in a quiet conflict, not with swords but with policy, trade, and ambition. Counts and countesses saw the void as opportunity. Alliances shifted. Old grievances reawakened. Kvatch, rebuilt in the wake of its destruction, gained new prominence. Its people hardened by loss, its leaders proud of their place in history. Meanwhile, Coral, Cheydinhol, and Leowian vied for influence in an increasingly fragmented landscape. Beyond Cyrodiil's borders, the Empire's grasp weakened. In Morrowind, the Tribunal was gone, and the Dunmer's faith had fractured. In Blackmarsh, the Argonians grew emboldened, having defended their lands with savage tenacity during the crisis. The Inzileel, a rising political force, began to reject imperial rule outright. In Elsweyr and Valenwood, rumors stirred of forgotten traditions being revived, of whispers carried by moonlight and forest root. Without the spiritual weight of the Septim name, the concept of empire no longer inspired reverence. It inspired questions. Why must we answer to the Tower of White Gold? Why cling to the promises of old, when the gods had turned away and let the skies bleed? Some clung tightly to tradition. In the imperial city, priests of the Eight Divines spoke louder than before, hoping to fill the silence left by Akatosh's final roar. Scrolls were copied feverishly. Old prophecies were revisited. Did the dragon fires truly need a burn? Could another rise with the blood of dragons? Scholars debated endlessly, but no clear answer emerged. The Blades, once protectors of the Septim line, found themselves lost. With no emperor to serve, their mission shattered. Some disbanded quietly. Others wandered Tamriel, searching for signs of dragonborn prophecy, hoping that perhaps Akatosh had not spoken his final word. Amid all this, the common people adapted. Life, after all, demanded resilience. Markets reopened. Festivals resumed, though more solemn than before. Children played in the shadow of burned gates, not fully understanding the terror their parents had lived through. A generation was growing that had not seen the fires of Oblivion, but they would grow in a world changed by it. And yet, through all the turmoil, there was no single enemy to face. No Daedric threat looming on the horizon. The danger now was subtler: apathy, ambition, and uncertainty. Tamriel had survived the fire, but now it faced the fog. Some spoke of a coming storm, that when the divine silence deepens, new gods rise to fill the void, not in the heavens, but in the hearts of mortals. Ambition breeds deities of its own, forged in thrones, in whispers, in blood. The Empire was adrift, not broken, not yet, but its anchor, its dragon blood, was gone. and the seas of fate were rising. The Oblivion Crisis was more than a chapter in Tamriel's long and turbulent history. It was a rupture, a cleaving of the world into two distinct eras, before the gates and after, though the portals to Mehrunes Dagon's realm have long since sealed. Their legacy lingers in the dust of ruined cities, the prayers of uncertain clergy, and the political tremors still felt across provinces. In the annals of the Empire, the crisis is recorded with reverence and dread. Scribes often write of it as a divine test, a moment when the gods looked down and weighed mortals on the scale of courage and fate. Yet others see it as a failure, not just of the gods, but of mortals who had grown complacent, overly reliant on symbols like the Amulet of Kings and the Dragon Fires, rather than cultivating true strength and unity. The name Martin Septim would echo across centuries as both a tragic martyr and a symbol of impossible hope. Though his reign lasted mere days, his sacrifice preserved Nirn from Daedric conquest. Statues were erected, sermons composed, his name added to the liturgies of Akatosh in temples across the empire. Some whispered that his soul had become a part of the divine, fusing forever with the time god, guarding the realm in silence. But memory fades. By the next generation, the crisis had become the stuff of bedtime stories and bardic embellishment. Children played games pretending to close Oblivion gates with toy swords. Scholars argued whether the crisis was truly a divine event or a geopolitical metaphor. Faith, once inflamed by the crisis, began to cool again. Meanwhile, the scars remained real. Kvatch, once annihilated in flame, became a symbol of both devastation and rebirth. Its people rebuilt with defiant pride, their city walls now engraved with tales of the siege and the hero who held the line. It became a pilgrimage site for survivors and descendants of Crisis-era veterans. The Mythic Dawn cult, long eradicated, became a specter in historical texts. Yet even in extinction, their name carried weight. Their leader, Mankr Cameron, was studied and feared in equal measure, a madman to some, a prophet to others. In dark corners of Tamriel, fragments of his teachings persisted, buried in tomes, whispered by zealots, or etched into cave walls as forbidden scripture. The crisis gave birth to a mythology of its own. Culturally, the crisis shifted Tamriel's perspective on the Daedra. Once regarded as distant and abstract entities, the Daedric princes now became real, terrifying forces in the minds of everyday citizens. Worship of the Daedra, once tolerated in some corners, faced widespread suppression. Shrines were defaced, cults hunted, and artifacts destroyed. Yet, paradoxically, fascination with Daedric power grew. Knowledge that once lived only in the shadows of Oblivion began seeping into the hands of mortal scholars. Magically, the crisis left its mark as well. Mages from the Arcane University dedicated entire fields of study to Daedric magic, Oblivion rifts, and planar travel. While their work was viewed with suspicion, some breakthroughs in restoration and defensive magic were credited to Crisis-era research. Even some battle mage techniques evolved directly from the tactics used during gate assaults. And politically, the crisis hastened the unraveling of the Empire's cohesion. The provinces remembered being left to fend for themselves, often unsupported by imperial legions. Trust fractured. This would later feed movements of independence, rebellion, and insurrection, tremors that would shake the very foundations of the White Gold Tower in the years to come. Yet perhaps the deepest legacy of the Oblivion Crisis lies in the psyche of Tamriel's people. A collective trauma was etched into the heart of the continent. Every red sunset reminded old soldiers of the Oblivion sky. Every thunderclap echoed the roar of Daedric beasts. Generations grew up with tales of a world nearly torn apart. Even as peace returned, a subtle tension remained, like a string pulled taut but never released. Some would argue the world became stronger because of it. That without the crisis, Tamriel would have decayed under its own complacency. Others mourn the innocence lost, the faith shaken, the divine covenant broken. But one truth remains unshakable. The Oblivion Crisis reshaped Tamriel forever. Its gates may be closed, but its echoes never truly fade. In the fragile silence following the Oblivion Crisis, as the Empire licked its wounds and the gods turned once again to silence, another force stirred quietly across the Somerset Isles. The Thalmor, long regarded as an elite political faction within the Altmare, began to ascend with disquieting speed. To many across Tamriel, the Thalmor were a mystery cloaked in elegance, a whisper of gold-robed advisors and arcane enforcers. But beneath the polished exterior, the roots of conspiracy were already coiling. The Altmare, ever proud and ancient, had watched the Empire falter with barely disguised disdain. To them, the Oblivion Crisis was a sign of the Empire's divine failure. The gods themselves had withdrawn their favor. The Thalmor seized this moment of theological and political uncertainty to proclaim a radical truth, that it was not the fault of mortals, but of the Empire's misguided reliance on a flawed divine order. Akatosh, they claimed, had failed to protect Nirn. The Thalmor would not. Within the Somerset Isles, the Thalmor's narrative took hold with chilling efficiency. They portrayed themselves as saviors, claiming credit for ending the Oblivion Crisis, a lie carefully woven, repeated, and refined until it became a national truth among their followers. According to the Thalmor, it was not Martin Septim or the Dragon Fires, but their arcane interventions and ancestral purity that closed the gates. No credible proof was offered, but none was needed. Their version of history spread like fog, impossible to hold, but impossible to ignore. Temples were quietly repurposed, historical records subtly altered. Youths were taught the Thalmor truth in schools, that the Oblivion Crisis had proven the Edra were weak, the Empire obsolete, and that Merkind must guide Nirn's future. Meanwhile, the Thalmor reached out across the provinces, funding loyalists, whispering into the ears of discontented nobles, and embedding agents within fractured territories. They presented themselves not as conquerors, but as preservers of order, the stewards of a new golden age, if only one would listen. Cyrodiil, still trembling from its scars, was ill-prepared to notice the seeds of subversion. The Empire was distracted by rebellion, political infighting, and the slow decay of its infrastructure. No one noticed when a diplomat disappeared in Valenwood, or when a seemingly minor trade agreement handed the Thalmor strategic ports along Elswere's coast. The crisis had blinded the world to subtlety, and the Thalmor thrived in that blindness. But not all were deceived. In the College of Winterhold, in the scroll vaults of the Imperial Library, and deep within the Blade's fragmented networks, concerned voices began to whisper warnings. They noted the rewriting of history, the disappearance of old records, the quiet arrests of dissenting scholars within Alinor. Patterns emerged, coordinated, intentional, insidious. The Thalmor's ideology, rooted in Altmare supremacism, spread beneath a veil of logic and enlightenment. They promised stability. They offered scholarship. They cloaked their ambitions in velvet and gold. And yet, their true aim was nothing less than the reshaping of Nirn's divine structure. The Edra were flawed, they argued. The Daedra were chaotic. Only the Thalmor, heirs to ancestral wisdom, could realign Mundus with its true purpose. Some even claimed the Thalmor sought to unravel the very fabric of time, to erase Talos from existence, to collapse the mortal-divine connection, and to reverse the acts of Lorcan himself. These ideas sounded mad until they weren't, until temples of Talos began to burn, until the worship of the Nine was outlawed in parts of Somerset, until emissaries in black robes walked freely through imperial cities. Whispers spoke of a grand plan, not simply to control Tamriel, but to erase its memory, to cleanse its spirit, to reshape history until only the Thalmor's version remained. The Oblivion Crisis had shattered the old world. The Thalmor would remake it in their image, and the world, weary and distracted, was too tired to stop them. The Dominion did not rise with banners and horns. It rose with silence, with signed parchments, forgotten promises, and truths rewritten. In the quiet years after the Oblivion Crisis, while the Empire reeled and rebuilt, the Thalmor laid the invisible foundation of their future, the Aldmeri Dominion Reborn, not as a proud memory of the past, but as a weapon sharpened in shadow. Their strategy was not to conquer, but to erode. Rather than launching open assaults, they exploited every fracture in Tamriel's landscape. Where men argued over succession, the Thalmor offered advisors. Where resources ran thin, they extended aid. When a faction faltered, a golden-robed emissary would appear, calm, articulate, persuasive, always observing, always listening. In Valenwood, ancient forests whispered of change. The Bosmere, long divided among tribal customs and the Green Pact, found themselves courted with reverence. The Thalmor brought order, magic, and unity, a voice that promised to respect the forest but demanded political allegiance. Over time, dissenting voices within the Bosmere ranks disappeared, some exiled, others silenced. A new government formed under Thalmor supervision, and Valenwood became the Dominion's first willing annexation. Elsewhere followed, broken into two provinces, Anakina and Palatine. After years of instability, it became easy prey. The Thalmor orchestrated a political reunification, cleverly branding it as liberation. Promises were made to restore Khajiit culture, reinvigorate trade, and banish imperial corruption. Many Khajiit embraced the change, desperate for stability. But soon, religious reformations began. Temples to Talos were quietly shuttered. Traditional moon priests were replaced with Thalmor-approved clergy. The old gods watched in silence as their names faded from stone and scroll. Meanwhile, the Empire remained paralyzed. With the Septim bloodline extinguished and the Elder Council weak, Cyrodiil turned inward. The Blades, diminished after the crisis, warned of the Thalmor's growing influence, but their words were dismissed as paranoia. The White Gold Tower stood, but its heart was hollowing. Across the provinces, the Thalmor played a long game. They created schools, libraries, and embassies that doubled as recruitment centers. They infiltrated guilds, recruited scholars, and even influenced magical research. Every cultural foothold was a step forward, and every silence from the Empire was a silent endorsement. But not all were blind. In the northern reaches, Skyrim's Nords grumbled about the loss of Talos, their divine war hero. Among the Red Guards of Hammerfell, suspicion toward foreign influence began to simmer. The seeds of resistance were present, though scattered. Yet for now, the Thalmor held the high ground, metaphorically and literally, gazing down from the shining spires of Alinor. Perhaps most dangerous was the Thalmor's mastery of narrative. They were not merely rewriting history, they were unmaking it. Documents vanished, old songs faded, myths were edited, reinterpreted to suit their philosophy. The past became a tool, malleable and obedient, forged in the forges of diplomacy and pride. In truth, their goal reached beyond Tamriel. It touched on the metaphysical, a desire to reshape the nature of reality itself. For the Thalmor believed the world was flawed. That Mundus was a prison. That mortality was a lie, an affront to their Myrish birthright. They sought not only dominance, but liberation from existence as mortals understood it. And so, the new Aldmeri Dominion grew, not with battle cries, but with bureaucrats and parchment, with erasure and precision. A knife beneath velvet, a shadow on parchment, a plan centuries in the making. The echoes of their rise rang softly now, but would soon crescendo. Tamriel had been weakened by Daedra. Now, it would be tested by Mare. Tamriel slept, not peacefully, but fitfully, as if aware that something unseen loomed on the horizon. A continent still battered by Oblivion's touch, still licking its wounds from Daedric fires, now stood under a waning sun. Yet in the silence that followed the crisis, there was a stillness that masked the gathering wind, like the hush before a storm, like the last exhale before a blade is drawn. The provinces, once unified under the dragon banner of the Empire, had drifted apart like leaves from a dying tree. Cyrodiil, once the gleaming jewel of Tamriel, now flickered in dull candlelight, governed not by emperors of divine blood, but by stewards and counselors more concerned with maintaining illusions than mending fractures. The Elder Council, desperate to project strength, quietly ignored the signs. Banditry increased, trade faltered, and across the heartlands, once proud forts crumbled into moss-choked ruins. In the west, Hammerfell endured its own unraveling. The Red Guards, fiercely independent, had grown wary of both imperial silence and Almarai whispers. Their cities buzzed with rumors of Thalmor emissaries probing for loyalty, of spies hiding among merchant caravans, of old heroes stirring from their exile. Yet no declaration was made, no blades were yet drawn. The forges were hot, but the swords remained sheathed. Skyrim, land of the north and of dragon legends, also bristled with unease. The Nords murmured in their mead halls, not of Daedra now, but of Talos, their god, their emperor, their symbol, and of how his worship was no longer spoken of aloud. Shrines had vanished overnight. Priests had gone missing. Some whispered of Thalmor patrols crossing borders under the guise of diplomatic inspection. Others lit secret candles beneath storm-battered statues of Talos, their prayers now defiance rather than devotion. The Cagiate of Elsewhere, though momentarily united, began to feel the tightening grip of the Dominion. Their moons still rose, their rituals still performed, but under watchful eyes. Stories were told, in hushed tones, of moon singers who sang the old ways and were never heard from again, of caravans disappearing along ancient roads, of scribes forced to retranslate holy texts with clarifications that aligned more with Thalmor theology than Khajiit truth. Morrowind remained scarred. The tribunal was gone. Red Mountain smoldered still. The Dunmare, ever proud, sought stability under their new order, but their eyes remained ever eastward, toward old grievances, lost gods, and deep philosophical questions about power, betrayal, and silence. The Argonians watched too, with wary distance. No longer slaves, no longer subjugated, but still cautious of a world that had never truly welcomed them. And then there was Black Marsh, untouched by the Dominion, unbound by imperial legacy. The Hist whispered among themselves in unknowable tones. Some said the Argonians were changing, becoming something more. Others claimed the Daedra never truly left the marsh. It was a land of fog and root, of mystery, of secrets that would never be mapped. Across Tamriel, dreams changed. Some were restless, filled with strange images of towers crumbling and stars blinking out. Others were still, but heavy, as though the soul knew what the mind could not yet say. Portents emerged in temple rituals, in prophetic scrolls, in the babbling of madmen. A sense that history had not ended with the crisis, but merely paused. And that soon, something older, something colder, would stir again. In the imperial city, beneath the white gold tower's shattered spire, archivists began to find torn pages missing from ancient books. A monk at the Temple of the One whispered that Akatosh had gone silent. The moon still turned, but some said they wobbled. And in remote corners of the world, mortals reported dreams of dragons. Not the tame kind of bedtime tales, but the ancient, immortal kind. Wings of fire, tongues of power, eyes like eternity. This was the silence before the storm. And Tamriel, still broken from its last reckoning, was about to face another. Not one of flame and Daedra, but of gods, lies, and time itself. Time is not a line in Tamriel. It is a wheel. A circle of ages, of empires rising and falling like breath, of gods remembered and forgotten, of heroes sung and cursed. And when the wheel turns, it does not ask permission. It simply moves, grinding kingdoms to dust, lifting peasants to thrones, and shattering the illusions of permanence that mortals cling to. After the Oblivion Crisis, there was a moment, just a heartbeat, when many believed the worst had passed. That the death of Mehrunes Dagon's invasion meant safety. That the sacrifice of Martin Septim had secured a lasting peace. That Akatosh had sealed the gates forever. But those who study the Elder Scrolls know better. They understand that every ending is but the shadow of a new beginning, and that the true cost of salvation is rarely paid all at once. In the decades following the crisis, the very foundation of the Empire continued to erode. Without a dragon-born emperor, the Ruby Throne became a stage for lesser men. Regents, generals, schemers, each pulling at the edges of a once glorious banner. Civil unrest boiled quietly in the provinces, while whispers of Thalmor resurgence crept through diplomatic chambers like smoke before a fire. The Altmare of the Somerset Isles, now rebranded as the Almorai Dominion, had not forgotten their centuries of perceived humiliation. They had studied the crisis with hungry eyes, noting every imperial failure, every faltering step, and from the ashes of the Empire's weakened grip, they began to craft something colder, sharper, more precise. The Dominion did not need Daedric portals to conquer. They would not raise Oblivion's armies. Instead, they would weaponize ideology, rewrite history, and poison faith itself. Their blade was not fire but doctrine. Their siege engines were words, treaties, sanctions, subtle purges cloaked in legislation and cultural reform. And their target was clear, the heart of what made Tamriel unified, the divine myth of Talos. To deny Talos was to shatter the bridge between man and God. It was to unmake the very soul of the Empire. And so, the Great War began not with swords, but with silence. Shrines defaced in the night, priests vanishing from temples, books rewritten. And when resistance finally came, it was met with fire. The White Gold Concordat, signed under duress, was not a treaty, it was a wound, one that never healed. It marked the beginning of a new era, the Fourth Era, one born not from triumph, but from trauma. And yet, amid the loss, amid the fraying of unity and the spreading chill of the Dominion's influence, there remained something ancient, smoldering beneath the surface of history. The return of the dragons. Not metaphorical, not poetic, but real. They came not from legend, but from time itself, reborn through the unraveling of the Dragon Fire's legacy. Their leader, Alduin, was no mere beast. He was the World Eater, the end of Culpus, a force older than myth, and far more final. Tamriel's silence shattered once more. But just as Alduin returned, so too did the Dovahkiin, the Dragonborn. Not of royal blood, not from a palace, but a wanderer, unknown, rising in the hour of need. For the wheel turns, and with it comes balance. An answer to every shadow, a voice to every silence. And so, from the ashes of the Oblivion Crisis, from the fracture of empires and the corruption of gods, came the next turn of the wheel. The question was never whether Tamriel would fall again, but who would stand when it did? Who would speak the true tongue? Who would remember? Because in this world, history does not sleep. It only waits. And the wheel always turns,